So the question is, why am I listening to you? And this is a thought that has crossed my mind so many times at, well, many intervals in my life, but let's just say university. Why am I listening to you? And you're facing a professor and you're thinking to yourself is it just me? Or does he or she not know what they're saying? And then it goes okay, but I'm still in this position where I'm supposed to listen to them. And when I say listen, I don't just mean understanding the literal sense of what they're saying. I'm saying, why do we believe them and why do we obey them? What is it that makes it go even though I feel like what you're saying is questionable, for some reason you hold more authority than me. And that, to me, is the status quo. Wikipedia tells me that it is the current state of social structure or values. Cool. So this is just where I'm placed within the social structure. This is my position. How do we get to this social structure? Wikipedia does not tell me. So this is what this video is going to tell you. So this video is going to be broken down into 3 parts. The first, which is the state, which I call the feeling of living in society. The state is something that we've created so that we can coexist with, multiple interests, multiple people, to avoid constant conflict. But yet, in my third part, I will explain to you why there is still conflict and how we deal with that. The feeling of why the state is everywhere and nowhere, and explaining obedience. The second part is the person, me and you. So the feeling and my body, this feeling of myself within this context, my body, my consciousness within the context of society. And I talk about habits, mind and body, and explaining Bourdieu's exis corporel, corporal hexis. And the third part is the market, feeling my position. So we gotta go from the big structure to me, and then me feeling within the structure based on my position within the structure. And here I talk about capital, which is so interesting because I didn't think that this was going to be political for some reason, but it is. So capital and conflict. And here I'll be explaining the status quo. Before we move on to the first part, I just want to say the interesting thing, and the many interesting things about what Bourdieu has said in this book, is that we usually mistake the idea that a person has their stature or their status because they have technical ability. But what he argues is that the reason why we believe that they have technical ability is because they possess stature and status. So is the position of my professor in front of me legitimate because he has the technical ability of being brilliant, smart, thought-provoking, hardworking? Or it is implicitly suggested that he actually is all these great things that come with technical ability. The interesting thing about this is that stature then comes from a place outside of technical ability, outside of this thing that we believe that a person has earned their position of status above you. But it actually comes from different capitals. So yeah, I'll see you in the first part, which is the state. So hey, part 1, state, l'état. I hope you enjoy this. The state can be defined as an authority that exerts with sovereignty, political power over a given territory and its population. Sovereignty just basically means that there is no one that they answer to. They're the top. And political is basically to do with social organization. Yet, in the collective and effective perception of the state, this represents a contradictory double relationship of omnipresence everywhere and of absence, not here. So there is this feeling of threat, right? My professor used things like your driver's license. So just things that remind you that you're just part of the society and you're accountable in a certain way. And the omnipresence is the fact that there's so many different things that reminds you that there is the government and the state, and the absence of it in and of itself is also part of its power. So with this, I included this quote that he mentioned, which is from Rousseau, The Social Contract, Book 2, Chapter 3. The strongest is never strong enough to be always the master, unless he transforms strength into right and obedience into duty. So just to unpack this a little bit. Right is legitimacy, the fact that it's founded in authority. And duty is something that you do willingly, something that you give up willingly. And I remember this thing that he said that really stuck with me. It was, for there to be power, it is necessary to have obedience. And obedience is a matter of freedom. The individual themselves must obey on their own accord. Strength or force, well, he says la force, and the direct translation is force, but then I noticed that people translate it to also strength. Becomes power when it no longer needs to be exerted, but when one arrives at obtaining what one wants from the other through obedience. Basically, the fact that we have the threat of punishment, and this is something that is gonna be in my next video about politeness and oppression, it's just this idea that when something is not even there, and it kind of like makes you maneuver in a certain way, makes you act in a certain way, it has an impact on the choices that you make. And the really interesting thing about here is this idea of force and power. The fact that you don't have to exert force is the power. So we can see that there are a lot of external factors that comes into play when we are actually creating this social structure of values. That influence is not just because something is legitimate, that it comes from the very top, that it is immediately or inherently legitimate, but that it is the recognition or the obedience. It's the influence that someone can have on you that makes them legitimate or have authority. So let's see what actually goes into the individual and how the individual internalizes or embodies their social context. So, Excès corporel by Bourdieu is La mythologie politique réalisée. So it is all the beliefs and ideas that are linked to the collective aspiration. So let's ignore like the thing that I wrote about le corps for the moment, but let's talk about habitus et hexis. Let's go back to Aristotle and let's go back to etymology. So habitus is Latin, it comes from habere, so avoir, to have, a habit. It is an association repeated so much that it becomes nature. And on the other side, we have hexis, which comes from exine, which is se comporter, comportment or behavior. And that is actually derived from ekhein, which is to have. And this is something that I wrote in my dissertation on a violent philosophy. But basically, it's the question of when something that we have is repeated so much that it becomes habit, and then when a habit is repeated so much that it becomes nature. So hexis is the incorporation of what one has to who one is. So you have this habit for so long that it becomes who you are. We've always had this dichotomy between mind and body, but this is where the consciousness and the body reinforces one another, where you have a habit, whether it's a physical habit or a mental association that's repeated so much that it becomes your nature, it becomes your disposition, it becomes who you are, your identity, if you want to say it that way. And Bourdieu takes this further. So Bourdieu refers the habitus as a set of dispositions that lead agents to act and react in a certain way. Dispositions give rise to practices, perceptions, and behaviors that are regular without being consciously coordinated or governed by any rules. So here we go back to the idea of obedience. And this is something that he talks about in his book about anticipation. So even if there's no rule or law that specifically says don't do this, based on like, you know, how I understand the context and how things work, and if this is prohibited, most likely that is prohibited, then you kind of anticipate like how you should act so they can avoid future sanctions. This is how you go beyond like actual rules and laws that actually threaten to punish you if you do something, that you are actually shaped to do or to not do other things in relation to actually constructed laws and rules. So he continues with, practicality is not so much a state of mind as a state of body. It is thus to the fact that the body has become the repository of ingrained dispositions that certain actions, certain ways of acting and behaving owe their appearance to naturalness. And how he's developed the idea of hexis is corporal hexis, which is a political mythology realized, incorporated, made permanent, a lasting way of standing, speaking, and walking, and hence of feeling and thinking. So again, here we go back to, it is not just our like mental associations and thoughts that influences our actions, but then once our actions are so incorporated in our being that it influences the way that we think and feel. Yeah, this is fun stuff. Okay, and now we can go back to the body. And the body is the site of an embodied history, the practical schema from which the body is organized and thus appear both as the product of history and as the source of practices and perceptions that reproduces the same history. And I just wrote a note like, we're the embodiment of the ideology of our time. And that's why like you look at like pictures from like, you know, whatever decade, like the 20s, 60s, 90s, and you go like, how do people dress like that? It's because they are physically the manifestation of ideology of the time, like the culture of the time. So who's the problem? Everyone's the problem, because we are the product of history and we are the source of all these perceptions and practices that reproduces this history. We perpetuate what it is that is around us. We perpetuate the status quo. So let's identify a little bit closer of what exactly is the status quo. Okay, we perpetuate it. It's part of our body. We're the product and the source. But again, tell me, how do I identify my position in the status quo that I am a part of? And that is in part 3, and I'll see you there. Welcome to part 3, which is the market, or what I call the structure of our interactions or exchange, the feeling of my position. And this is what I came up with. It's kind of dirty, but let me tell you, it is exactly what we need to know. So the market. Bourdieu describes this as a structured space of positions within which the same positions or their interactions are determined by the distribution of different kinds of resources or capital. So our position is based on our capital. Like, big shocker. But what's interesting about Bourdieu is that he tells us that there are many types of capital, many species of capital. And the 3 main ones that he mentioned was economic capital, material wealth in the form of money, goods, and securities, cultural capital made of knowledge, skills, and other cultural acquisitions, of which technical and educational qualifications are an example, and symbolic capital, referring to the accumulation of prestige and honors. And that all these 3 capitals are interchangeable. So his example was certain educational qualifications can be converted into gainful employment. Did I tell you I was at Sorbonne? Jokes aside though, that is why I have a bit of authority in what I'm saying, because I am in the best university in all of France for philosophy, and I'm working like crazy, and sometimes I get really good grades, and that is something that is part of my capital that I'm trying to convert into other forms of capital, or that I feel like helps me within my position in society. It's like, yeah, you know this, but then I didn't see it so clearly before. And I think about like different cultures, right? Like different countries and how they prioritize different kinds of capital. And not every capital has its value and weight in the same way in different countries and different societies and cultures. I feel like France, I would say like cultural capital is huge, and that's why like philosophy is really respected, even though half the time you're like, what are you gonna do after? Just be a professor? I don't know, I'm not there yet. And America is more like economic capital. It's just something that I really thought about, like in terms of not only are there different species of capitals, but maybe in different cultures and contexts, different capitals take you further. So then like, you know, depending on not only like in each country, but maybe in each field or each domain, different capital also leverages your position in a different way. So in each field or each market, marché, Bourdieu says that it is always a site of conflict between individuals seeking to maintain or modify the distribution of its specific form of capital. And this is interesting because the whole reason why we're obedient towards our obligations towards the state is because we are promised peace and we are promised security, like reasonable security in our existence within a society. And I feel like this conflict is what explains the violence that still exists within our society. And to finally get to the point, the current distribution of capital is the status quo. So when a person wants to either maintain or modify the status quo, the current distribution of capital, the thing that defines where it is our position is within society, that's when we have conflict. So this is why I had to break the video down into 2 parts about how within capital itself there is an exchange, and like how there's a whole mechanism that leads to the conflict. And it's not just about, you know, this giant chunk of this ambiguous idea of what capital is, and one person has it, one person doesn't. But there's like all these working parts that cause so many different tensions and so many different considerations when it comes to understanding our position in society. So if you found this helpful, please support my channel. Please like, share, and subscribe, or all 3. I think it's been brought to my attention that people think that AI could do this video. Maybe in the future, I don't know. Technology is an amazing thing. But for right now, if you would like people like me to continue to make videos like these, please support my channel and thank you.